sit down. As you are well aware, our speaker this afternoon is Mr. Steve Allen. His topic for today will be education, the key to today's problems. Mr. Allen is indeed qualified to speak on this topic because a little known fact about him is that he has attended 18 schools in his lifetime. I have a biography here from the CBS television network, which is dated October 23rd, 1964. So it's rather out of date, but I would like to give you a few facts, even though they may not be up to date. As of October 23rd, 64, Mr. Allen had 8 books to his credit. He has performed on the Broadway stage and in motion pictures. He has 30 albums to his credit and an astounding 2,000 songs. He writes approximately 3 songs a week. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Steve Allen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm terribly sorry I was late. As far as you're concerned, I'm sorry. But I was getting freeway bulletins as I was hurrying over here. There was considerable congestion in my bronchial tubes or someplace. But there's some, as you may know if you've tried to drive over this morning, there's some building going on. It may seem somewhat redundant for me, or for that matter any speaker, to come into this educational institution and speak to you about education, since that's what you are spending practically all your time acquiring. But I come to you for perhaps an even more redundant purpose, and that is to suggest that there is a very direct connection between the education you are acquiring, such as it is, and the solutions to the difficulties which face our society. I'm very encouraged, let me say at the outset, at the difference in the response to various ideas I've been disseminating the last few years, difference between audiences composed generally of young people and audiences composed of people, say, over the age of 45. I find that the young are considerably more receptive to my ideas and that they need them considerably less. What I'm going to do during the limited time we have here today is just list a random group of social problems. You're aware of all of them. I'm telling you, in most respects here, nothing new. Then after the simple enumeration of these social dilemmas, we'll take up the problem as to how we might go about solving some of them. We don't naturally have the time to cover all the important issues that might be covered, simply because there are too many of them. And I'm not putting them in any particular order of importance, because for one thing, there is no such order of importance. It's a matter of every individual man's opinion. So if you jot any of these specifics down, and after I'm through speaking, you may tear the list apart and scotch tape it back together again in any order that conforms to your own prejudices. And I hope to convince you that you have a lot of those, because you do. And you ought to be convinced of what is. So to jump right in, number one, the threat of international communist aggression. It's encouraging to notice that increasingly, especially the last 3 or 4 years, people are finally beginning to study this issue in fairly large numbers, although to much too great an extent they're taking their instructions from professional knuckleheads. But at least there should be very deep understanding on the part of the American people on this issue. I think we could all agree on that, whatever our political point of view. And we make a mistake if we study communism as an isolated phenomenon. The reason that's a mistake is simply because the phenomenon is not isolated. It must be studied as it exists, which is in a context of worldwide poverty, disease, population pressures, and hunger. I sometimes get the impression that at least a few Americans imagine that our world was some sort of economic paradise in which social justice, happiness, and prosperity were common, until one day the communists came along and out of sheer perversity decided to stir up trouble. That view, as you know, is absurd. Communism came into existence for a number of reasons, among them the failures of Christianity and the failures of capitalism. Both those institutions have much of which to be proud, but they obviously have not achieved their ultimate objectives, or communism could not exist. And if we don't understand that much at the outset, then it seems to me we're not going to have a very good chance in the competition with the Marxist powers for the minds of men all over the world. So what we have to show now is that our prescriptions for the world's ills are better than those that the communists propose. Incidentally, in case it should occur to you to wonder, as I hope it does, why in a speech about education I am referring at such length to all these social problems, I should explain that I do so because all of these dilemmas connect very directly with the question of human rationality, the encouragement of which I take to be the primary purpose of education. And this state of our national mental health or our political rationality is relevant. It's essential to the development of solutions to these predicaments with which we're confronted. Now, a brief word about anti-communism. There are some misguided people who seem to suppose that communism is about the only really serious problem we have. Or if they don't go quite that far, they imply that we're entitled to give other problems short shrift until we find the solution to the dilemma that communism poses. But if it were true that our only real problem was communism, then our only real virtue would be anti-communism. It is indeed virtuous. Anti-communism is now for us a necessity. But it's not nearly enough to establish political virtue or wisdom. Not nearly enough. Adolf Hitler was probably the most active and energetic anti-communist the world has known. But he succeeded in plunging the world into a war that killed some 40 million people, and which, in the end, by greatly increasing the power of the Soviet Union, placed additional millions into the communist camp. This is just one example of many which could be cited, in which unwise anti-communism works for the benefit of our ideological enemies. So anti-communism is not nearly enough. One wants to know not only what a man is against, but also what he is for. Number two, nuclear weapons dilemma. I draw your attention to my use of the word dilemma, by which I mean to suggest that nobody has all the answers under this heading. But I've observed that few Americans, very few of us, seem to appreciate that a true scientific revolution has occurred in our time. Some of you are studying the scientific revolutions of earlier times in your history classes. You are aware, therefore, that when these revolutions took place, the world was drastically, radically, profoundly altered. And therefore it's remarkable that we are living in the middle of one of these things now, and we don't seem to perceive its implications or its dimensions. The bomb that burned about 100,000 mostly civilian men, women, and children at Hiroshima was not just a considerably larger weapon than the World War II blockbuster. It had the explosive power not of, well, to start with a concept with which we're all generally familiar, say a pound of TNT, enormous in itself, not of 100 pounds of TNT, not of 1,000 pounds of TNT, but 20,000 tons of TNT. And that amount of power, as I suppose most of you know, is, compared to today's hydrogen bombs, considered in the small potatoes class. That's now a tactical weapon. If we were to develop a scale according to which the World War II blockbuster would be represented by the height of a 1-foot ruler, then the Hiroshima and Nagasaki weapons would be represented by a line running as high as the Empire State Building. And a full-power H-bomb of today's sort would be represented by a line running about as high as the orbit of Sputnik 1. So you can see that what we're talking about is not, as I say, just an extension of something we already had going. This is an entirely new order. I can take no great amount of time, obviously, to follow up at length any one of these specifics I'm talking about, but I'll make just a couple of more comments on this under this heading. Even those few of us who do any thinking and studying of this dread problem usually seem to do so only in political or military terms. Now, we do have to think of the issue in those terms. We do have our national security to consider, certainly. But there is also a moral dimension to this question. Now, here's something remarkable. The churches have been very clear about this. The churches, the popes, the bishops, all religious groups have spoken generally quite clearly on this issue. But I sometimes wonder, is anybody listening to them? Ask yourself the question. If you have a church affiliation, have you read any literature of any kind from your own denomination about this specific issue? Number three, the struggle that concerns so many of us is our minds, particularly this morning. The struggle for civil rights. You know what's been happening in Alabama. In another state of the Union, over 40 churches, just to limit our consideration to one type of structure, over 40 churches have been burned and bombed in the last 6 months. Now, in competition with the communist powers, we preach freedom, equality, and democracy to the peoples of Africa, South America, and Asia. And yet in some parts of this nation, as you know, Negroes are not permitted to vote. In other parts, lest we feel too smug about Alabama, in other parts of this nation, they're not permitted to work or to live. And some churches that consider themselves Christian will not even permit a Negro to enter for the purpose of worshiping Almighty God. Several months ago, I made a trip through Asia, and I discovered they know about all of this over there. It obviously isn't doing us any good. By that observation, I mean to suggest that there is a connection between our national and individual conduct and the formulation of our nation's foreign policy. Remember that when we discuss this issue, we are not talking about statistics only. You can't cry over statistics unless you're very imaginative. You can only cry over individual tragedies. We're not talking about voting blocks or about real estate. These considerations are relevant, but they're not of the essence. We're talking about human beings. Call them whatever you want to bring them into focus for you. American citizens, children of God, whatever. But whatever you call them, you will realize that we are dealing with a moral issue, and don't let anyone tell you we are not. Number four, problems of education. You know generally what they are. Not enough good schools, low salaries for teachers, dropout problems, and that sort of thing. And in this connection, I want to commend the young men of UCLA who are connected with the UCLA tutorial project. I think all of you, I'm sure many of you do know about this, but all of you should. It started in the summer of 1963 with about 60 tutors and about 80 tutees. And its primary purpose was to combat a 50% dropout rate. And at the present moment, the group has over 500 UCLA students tutoring 750 high school and elementary school students in 3 economically depressed areas, Venice, Culver City, and East Los Angeles. This project, as I say, deserves as much encouragement and support as it can receive. The name of it, again, if you don't know about it, is the UCLA Tutorial Project. And it has my great admiration and respect. Now, under this particular heading, consider this tragic paradox. The communists are, in my opinion, mistaken in their premises and brutal in their methods, but they are not ignorant. I have visited the Soviet Union. I was deeply impressed with the Soviet educational system. Communists, I repeat, are not ignorant. If we are, isn't that some sort of supreme historic joke? Number 5, problem of economic injustice in this country, the poverty problem, war on poverty, or whatever you want to call it. This, as you know, is the richest nation on earth, and yet about 20 million of us live in abject poverty, and about 35 million of us could be properly described as very poor. A book everyone should read on this subject is The Other America, Michael Harrington's book, The Other America. I suggest you make a note of that. The Other America. Number 6, our migratory farm workers specifically live a life that would be considered poverty-stricken even behind the Iron Curtain or in Asia, Africa, or South America. Some of these workers make the marvelous salary, and they make it in this state, too, of $500 or $600 a year. And they try to raise families on this income. And remember that their poverty, their ignorance, disease, and discouragement are being handed down to their children. Number 7, many of our big cities are being strangled by slums. 8, our prison problem is a national disgrace. There are a few states of this union, and this I'm glad to say is one of them, California, that have prisons that at least bear some logical resemblance to the 20th to the 20th century. But others in this enlightened and affluent land have prisons that look like something out of 19th century fiction. And therefore it is no wonder that they are more training grounds for criminals than they are places where men are reformed and rehabilitated. Number 9, our approach to the narcotics traffic is another national disgrace. Alone, absolutely alone of all the nations on this planet, we have this narcotics addiction problem of the unique and formidable dimensions with which we're all generally familiar. And about all that many people seem able to suggest to do about this is to make prison sentences more harsh. Never seems to occur to these people that no matter how harsh the penalties, the problem still gets worse. And I believe it will continue to get worse until we adopt a medical and therapeutic approach. Until, in particular, we support such programs and approaches as that exemplified by the Synanon House. And also until we do whatever we can do to take the profit out of the traffic in drugs, which in other parts of the world can be purchased for pennies. Because once the profit motive is gone, there will be no more incentive for peddlers to induce additional people to use narcotics, nor will it then be relevant to corrupt police and political figures with money derived from the narcotics trade. Number 10, the condition of the American Indian is something for which every American ought to feel the deepest shame. Number 11, because of dramatic medical advances, people are now living to what was once called a ripe old age. But of course, when they reach very advanced years, they can no longer work. And this in turn means that the majority of them therefore cannot afford the heavy medical and drug expenses that are inevitable in every case except those involving sudden death. And this problem, too, will continue to get worse whatever we do in the near future. Now, I'm not here this morning to recommend to you either a Democratic or a Republican or a liberal or a conservative solution as regards the issue of medical care for the aged. In a certain large sense, I don't give a damn what the solution is. I simply say there must be a solution. And the people we can no longer afford to listen to are those who deny the existence of this problem and say, well, people just have to look out for themselves. Number 12, the problem of mental illness. This list obviously could continue indefinitely, but we don't have time, and I don't want to send you back to your next classes too depressed. Here's the picture under this heading. About 1 out of 10 Americans will, at one time or another, have some form of mental or emotional illness. We're getting to the point now where we will have almost 200 million Americans, so we're talking roughly about 20 million people. But the situation is far more serious than this bare statistic suggests, because we now know that mental illness is an important factor in at least half, possibly much more, but at least half of all the countless millions of seemingly simple medical and surgical cases treated by doctors and hospitals. Some researchers are coming to feel that even such illnesses as heart disease, tuberculosis, and cancer may often have an emotionally connected basis. And certainly even the least knowledgeable person can see that the problem of mental illness is directly related to such other social dilemmas as crime, narcotics addiction, alcoholism, juvenile delinquency, the divorce explosion, compulsive gambling, homosexuality and other sexual abnormalities, bigotry, prejudice, political irrationality, and fanaticism, to mention just a few. So these are the problems, only 12 of which, well, of dozens that could be mentioned. Question now, as I earlier suggested, is what are our chances of dealing with them? The answer naturally varies from issue to issue, but it seems to me that the overall case for optimism is not at the moment very strong. And the reason I think this is the case is that we apparently don't really like to think. We know how to mentally respond. We cannot avoid that. Something occurs in our computers in reaction to all of our experience on the basis of our conditioning and heredity and so forth, but we don't seem to feel really comfortable thinking new thoughts. We as a people distrust science, we prefer illusion to reality, and we prefer the dangerous status quo, and I've just given you only 12 reasons why it is terribly dangerous. We prefer this status quo to the change that is necessary to our salvation. G.K. Chesterton, you know, once said that Christianity had not been tried and failed, but that it had been found difficult and so never tried. And the same thing, I think, is true of the scientific, rational, humanist approach to life. We delude ourselves, I repeat, that we are a scientifically advanced people. The astounding technical achievements of our age were made not by the mass of us. I know I personally have contributed nothing to these achievements whatsoever, but they were made by a tiny fraction of 1% of the population, and that frequently against the apathy, inertia, or bitter opposition of the 99+%. It is true that we boast of skyscrapers, rockets to the moon, dramatic cures for certain diseases, but this proves only that a few of us live intellectually in the 20th century. Most of us live in far earlier times. And if we have our skyscrapers, we are still so ignorant and superstitious that we will not permit the 13th floor of them to be labeled as what it is. It's there, of course, like all of our problems, but we deny its existence and call it the 14th. And this is not the fault of our architects. They don't want to call that 13th floor the 14th, but we force them to. It is our stupidity which limits them. And most of us, instead of approaching a new problem rationally, will fall back on our cluttered file of superstition, nonsense, prejudice, and misinformation. So it's no wonder that we so often fail. It would be remarkable if we did not. And this little bit of news about the 13th floor is not just brought to your attention because it's unusual, but because it is typical. Consider just a few beliefs now, beliefs that are fervently held by millions, perhaps by the majority on this earth. Perhaps there may be no one here who believes any of these things, but I assure you the ideas that I'm about to mention are extremely popular. Opposites attract. As Maine goes, so goes the nation. It always rains on Good Friday. Fish is brain food. Raw oysters have aphrodisiac value. President Truman got us into the Korean War. There's nothing new under the sun. The murderer always returns to the scene of the crime. The Empire State Building sways several feet in a strong wind. If an expectant mother suffers a fright, her baby may be marked as a result. The mental health movement is a communist plot. Fluoridation of water is a communist or Jewish plot, and probably both. Negroes are naturally inferior to whites. It's unlucky to walk under a ladder. A horseshoe or a rabbit's foot will bring good luck. Eating pickles and milk in combination will make you sick. The New England colonies offered freedom from religious persecution. Well, this list, too, I'll just cut off arbitrarily because you would eventually literally fall into your graves if I attempted to keep you here long enough to complete it. It can never be completed because it is daily being added to. But if so much foolishness abounds, you might think, then would not the world welcome the occasional fellow who came along with some nugget of truth? Well, those of you who have studied history know the answer to that question is negative. Consider one illustration. When anesthetics were discovered more than a century ago, the Scottish physician Sir James Simpson recommended their use in childbirth. But he was quickly rebuked by some clergyman who reminded him that God had said to Eve, "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." And if a woman was under the influence of chloroform, the clergy wanted to know, how could she properly sorrow? Well, Dr. Simpson was clever enough to argue that since God had put Adam to sleep when he extracted the rib from which woman was made, there would seem to be nothing wrong, in principle at least, in administering anesthetics to men. And believe it or not, it actually took some time before the benefits of anesthesia could be charitably extended to women. Now, it's important to understand that this debate did not take place between two nuts outside a pool room. The men conducting this debate were pillars of their society, and the point is they are represented by counterparts this very morning in our society. This plot line is a very old one. You know what happened to Christ, to Copernicus, to Socrates, to Darwin, to Freud, to Frank Lloyd Wright, to countless artists and saints and composers and prophets who broke through the traditional, who expanded the horizons of their art or science or philosophy. Were they applauded by their associates, as you would expect in a rational world? No, they were usually condemned, sometimes literally to death. But lest we feel too smug about our ancestors, let's bring things a little closer now to the present moment. Today, no conservative, I'm sure, or even reactionary, would dream of urging a return to the 50-hour work week. The 40-hour week is one of the things of which we boast. But the older people present may be able to remember that those who first recommended the 40-hour week were called communists, socialists, radicals, if not agents of the devil himself. One more example. It will not, on this pleasant occasion, seem very radical to suggest that young children of 8 or 9 or 10 ought not to work in dirty, dark, cold, and dangerous factories for 12 or 13 or 14 hours a day to earn just a few pennies. And yet there was a time in this nation when exactly that occurred and when it was common. And the brave reformers who first made so bold as to suggest that this was an immoral and inhuman practice and that therefore child labor laws ought to be passed were also called radicals, subversives, revolutionaries. It was ever thus, and it is still happening this morning. Now, you miss my point altogether if you suppose that what I'm getting at here is that our ancestors were sometimes stupid. They were indeed, but that's not what I'm getting at. My point is that we, you and I'm not talking about those terrible people out of this room, I'm talking about us here, present, are just as stupid. And we will make very little progress until we admit as much. The field of spiritual philosophy, it is a commonplace and a truth that you cannot possibly improve until you admit there is something wrong with you. And you cannot possibly learn anything until you admit that you don't know something. And what handicaps us, I repeat, is this relative, at least, inability to think. A leading Los Angeles heart specialist told me a couple of years back about a conversation he'd had with one of his patients, a wealthy, personable, and presumably at least fairly well-educated woman. They were talking about the disastrous fires that had destroyed so many homes up in the hills at that time. And she said to him, and I wrote down the note when he mentioned this to me, so I at least know that I'm quoting him accurately. She said, "Tell me, doctor, do you have any doubt that the communists did it?" Now, what is wrong here is not the alleged fact. We have no way of knowing what caused the fire. Maybe the communists, maybe it was the man in the moon. It's irrelevant. We don't know. Now, what's wrong with this woman's question is the faulty thought process that it reveals, the utterly inadequate method of problem solving. The woman was apparently unable to distinguish, and this is very important, the woman was apparently unable to distinguish a remote possibility from either a probability or a fact. And again, if I may keep belaboring the morals of all these illustrations, the point is that you all do this, and I do it. But if you try to catch yourself doing it, you'll do it less, and that means you will be improved. And what usually makes us function this stupidly is a prejudgment, a prejudice, an ego commitment. We love our ideas, not so much because of any inherent virtue, but because they are ours. Now, one fascinating aspect of this situation to me, and I must conclude here soon because we don't have much time, is that so much of this haphazard substitute for thought takes place in people who have had a high school and or a college education. And this suggests to me that there may be something radically wrong at the heart of this nation's and probably this world's educational process, in that it seems to concentrate on teaching us what to think and gives us very little instruction in how to think. Now, this is certainly not a matter for an either-or choice. We obviously have to be taught what to think. We have to be taught the facts. But the whatness is beginning to drown us in this technically complex society. Even the specialists now cannot even keep up with all the literature in their own narrow fields. There are libraries that can accumulate it, but no one man can anymore in many fields. And we forget most of the facts we're taught. We don't know how to look them up, and that's the best we can do, the way human beings are put together. But what we need now desperately as individuals and as a society is instruction, I repeat, in how to think. I don't care through what door you approach this area, whether you come in through the area of philosophy or formal logic or general semantics or mental health, or call it what you will, we must approach it somehow. But even this, lest you want to run out and form some new church, even this is no panacea. It won't introduce us at once into paradise, but certainly we would be much better off than we are now, ruled by our prejudices, our superstitions, and our fears. We must learn our limitations. If we don't know that, then we can't do much of anything. I have personally come to assume, if not absolutely conclude, that nobody can correctly report anything. Something is either always added or left out or distorted. And if anything like this is true, then we must be as skeptical and as scientific and objective as possible about all reports. And you will be most tempted and perhaps most misled by those reports which are music to your ears. If you hear a speaker who you think is talking your language, then you may be in the most danger. You may be in the most danger at this very moment, if what I am saying conforms to your prejudices. No two people, it seems to me, agree completely about anything. In one sense, therefore, I am not one man speaking to you. If there are 1,000 of you in this room, then there are 1,000 of me up here, because no two of you see me from the same point in space. No two of you bring to this moment in time the same experience, the same hereditary material. If there were 10 million of you here and we passed out examination papers and asked each of you to give some kind of a brief report as to what I am talking about, even in that enormous number, no two would agree as to what I'm talking about. Sometimes when people follow my general line of argument along to this point, they decide to approach the problem, as I suggested earlier, through the door of semantics. They decide to be more careful about words. Well, that's fine. As I said, there's no wrong way to come into this area. But language carries its own traps, and words are really a terribly poor method of communication. They're probably the best we'll ever develop. but they're very faulty. Some languages are worse than others. English is a deplorable language with which to speak and to think. And if you know that, you'll speak and think a little bit less dogmatically, I believe. Another reason it's very difficult for you to think clearly is because you have, as I've already suggested, a lot of nonsense in your mind. This is not because you are inherently stupid. No matter how smart you are, you have a lot of nonsense in your mind through no fault of your own. Because, among other things, other reasons, every single agency in your society sometimes misleads you. Do not look for scapegoats. Do not look for evil in this. There is surprisingly little evil intent, if any, in this world. Almost all the harm that is done by men is done by men who have the very best of intentions. But every agency, I repeat, occasionally misleads you, and it's sometimes quite difficult to distinguish what is valid from what is nonsense. And lastly, you often mislead yourself. You refuse daily to face reality if to do so causes you pain or frightens you. May I ask what the time problem is now? I know some of you have to leave very shortly. Does the bulk of the audience have to leave in about 2 minutes? Good, then my task is hopeless. I obviously am not going to be able to change the world with one little speech under any circumstance, and particularly not in 1 minute or two. Therefore, by way of conclusion, I'll just say that whenever my schedule permits, I accept an invitation to speak to young people. I'd rather speak to one audience of young people than 10 of people, say, over 50, because I think after you get to that age, unless you're a very unusual person, your brain is pretty much turned into cement anyway. But your brains, your minds are still, in a sense, more plastic. And my generation has generally failed to solve not only these 12 problems I've mentioned this morning, but practically all other problems. They are still referred to as problems for the obvious reason that they haven't been solved. I just hope that my generation can accomplish one thing, that is, avoid destroying the world just long enough to at least hand it over to you in one piece. Because I am convinced, perhaps misled by my hopes, but nevertheless I think I am honestly convinced that your generation is going to do a better job in dealing with these dilemmas than mine did. And I say this, whatever your political prejudice or point of view, I see an increasing dedication on the part of young people of the right, the middle, the left, all across this nation as I go about speaking. You see this made clear by very many instances, the Peace Corps, various political groups on campuses across the country. This is all to the good, because the young people of my generation, for the most part, goofed off. I sometimes wonder how we managed to muddle through it all, and of course we didn't. We stumbled into wars, one of which, as I've mentioned, killed 40 million of us. So I have great confidence in you. There's much more, naturally, that I would hope to say to you this morning, but apparently we do not have any more time now. I, of course, don't want to delay anyone. Now, is it your suggestion that those who have to leave now do leave and some will remain behind for a question period? Is that the idea? All right. Well, if you have to run along. Thanks very much for permitting me to speak to you.
Thank you. Be careful.